Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande. Crisis of Faith, Episode 165.
Day 90, Osirian.
People from one human-populated planet would rarely count as neurotypical on any other human-populated planet. To say this requires some measure on the human-populated planets across the multiverse. But if you pick a sensible such measure, the truth of the statement should be obvious enough on priors. Begin, say, from 50,000 years ago in Dathilan's history. Most descendants of that primate species can interbreed with each other, if they're still extant and haven't deliberately shaped themselves otherwise. Thelim's world of Earth branched off no earlier than that, quite a bit later, in fact. Keltham looks human. He can interbreed with humans. He is, in fact, human. But Keltham, in several ways, does not work quite like a Galarianite expects humans, or their related mortal species, to work. Dathilan, from the perspective of most human-populated worlds, has some unusual problems. Dathilan has noticed those problems at all, but they don't know those problems are unusual or unusually severe. They have nothing else to compare themselves to. The Dathilani don't know that their failures are not part of the plan, any more than they think of themselves as being unusually good at coordination or decision theory, or their planet having above-average intelligence. Every human-populated world that is alone in its neighbourhood of the multiverse dances like nobody is watching, you could say. If a planet is embarrassing itself in some regard compared to the average descendant of that 50,000-a-year ancestral branching point, most such planets have absolutely no idea. If you ask the inhabitants to guess where they fall on the unseen spectrum of world branches, they will have no more sensible guess than probably we're somewhere in the middle. Dathilan know they have a problem where a lot of them aren't very happy a lot of the time. Their current approach is to have a society-wide norm that unusually unhappy people shouldn't have kids, and, to a lesser extent, that unusually happy people should have a lot of kids. But that takes time, so for now, the Dathilani carefully tweak their environment to make it possible for as many people as possible to be happy within the framework of their current genetics. This takes a lot of tweaking and a lot of work, and the Dathilani don't particularly realise there's anything odd about that. They don't have other human worlds to compare themselves to. The Dathilani carefully raise their children in an environment free of spoilers about sex existing, or how it works, so that young adults may have the pleasure of discovering that for themselves, among themselves, in an effort to preserve every bit of that rare stuff that is fun. They relegate pornography to the ill-advised consumer goods store, because if a Dathilani reads a book about interesting people having incredibly interesting and exciting and fun and complicated sex, they will start to hold their own sexual encounters to the same standard before they would naturally have become bored. Why wantonly burn up the time remaining until ordinary sex starts to seem repetitive? So thinks Dathilan. They're aware they have a problem, an aspect of reality that isn't as good as it could be. Of course they're aware. Dathilani, by their nature, and by comparison to an average human world descending from their 50,000-year ancestor, are aware of dissatisfactions like that to an incredible degree. Their world is so optimized, not least because any visible problems bug the crap out of them. The Dathilani are aware they have a problem where it's hard for people to be happy, and they're applying all of the heritage optimization pressure they can spare from more important matters to solving it. They don't know they have an unusual problem. The Dathilani don't know that their average species cousin gets bored less quickly, or can much more easily become happy. The Dathilani don't know that their cousins experience emotions in general more strongly than Dathilani do. The difference is more pronounced for positive emotions, but it's true about negative emotions too. How'd it happen? Nobody knows. At this point they screened their history. Obviously the change didn't happen on purpose. Probably there's something like a balance inside minds, some sheerly neural relative weight of cortex and thalamus, and the ancestors of civilization selected on themselves for intelligence without paying proper attention and obeisance to that balance. So Dathilan dances, less happily and excitedly than average, like nobody is watching. Here's another not-so-little irony of Keltham's life, one that he'll probably never have a chance to learn now. When Keltham reached age 20, and civilization first revealed to him the subsidy it would pay to him to have kids, as is kept obscured until the socially usual childbearing age of 20 for obvious Tuadathilani reasons. You don't go around telling 8-year kids that secret prediction markets expect that civilization won't want more of them, or not enough to pay for it. That could be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and then if you tell the other kids that civilization probably does want more of them, the silence is conspicuous for those who aren't being told. Judgments like that aren't final to begin with. Sometimes, indeed rather often, kids turn out differently than expected. These are not confident prediction markets. It has not been found to be fun for kids if you tell them that unconfident prediction. This too is information that harms the hearer. Better not to know if you're not a keeper. And the only way to be silent about it to some kids is to be silent about it to all of them. Civilization would have told Keltham that they did, in fact, want more of him. He's shifted honourably selfish away from altruistic, yes, and that's a little weird. He's noticeably less reflective than the average Dathilani, and that's bad. But he also experiences emotions more strongly, has stronger drive than the average Dathilani, and that matters a lot. This organism is made happy more easily. He's happier than you'd expect for a self-conceived misfit. It would have outweighed his selfishness in the eyes of what civilization had voted on as its future targets, and the possibility would not have been lost on civilization that maybe that higher selfishness business was correlated with the happiness part. It's definitely the sort of interesting mind state where, if nothing else, you'd like him to have 4 kids out of sheer curiosity, to find out if the traits stay correlated in his children. There are Dath Ilani who would have gone through everything Keltham just did, and felt nothing but a distant sadness about losing Carissa after having barely managed to connect to her in the first place. They might have walked through the entire thing exactly correctly, not because they are that disciplined, but because their emotions were never strong enough to knock them off their way or even push on them too hard. On being told it was all a lie, they would not have dissociated from a single one of their emotions, even if it felt relatively awful, because it was so rare for them to feel anything even that strongly in their lives. They'd feel that same distant sadness, maybe, on turning 20 and learning that civilization's institutions would offer them negligible subsidy for having children. A lot of people like that need to not have kids if you want to create space for people like Keltham to have 4 kids experimentally to see about fixing that problem.
Keltham feels unusually strongly for someone of Dath Ilan. By the standards of Galarian outside of Cheliax, not so much. After having previously dissociated some of his emotions to run in emergency mode, Keltham isn't able to cry, even in private, until he puts on the Splendor headband that's found for him, knowing, as he does so, that he might well end up never wanting or able to take the headband off again. Afterwards, Keltham consumes the food brought for him, skims some books in the library. He tells them that tomorrow he'll probably want to talk to an expert on theology and afterlives, who can at least point him at which books to read. He asks for a sleep spell, technically deep slumber. He doesn't really feel like trying to go to sleep naturally.
Day 91, Osirian.
Keltham awakes with his mind feeling numb, dissociated, distantly sad. He looks at the Splendor headband, which he did manage to take off last night before asking for the sleep spell. Keltham decides not to put it on, just yet, for a while. There's a saying out of Dath Ilan, you can face life without drugs, but there's often no point in trying. In context, it doesn't have exactly the import that the bare words sound like, because it's an instance of a proverb template about how you can X without Y, but there's often no point in trying. That proverb template in turn is intimately paired by rhyme and prosody to a successor proverb. You probably should try at all, like once or twice. Just be willing to give up if it turns out there's no point. Keltham is going to try not to get addicted to Splendor immediately, and in the middle of a major life crisis. He prays. He asks for 2 comprehend languages, in case he needs them for reading books in other languages. He asks for 2 truth spells. He keeps his owl's wisdom. He leaves the rest of his list blank. If his god is back in touch with him, his god should be able to fill the list as his god sees fit.
Commune, fucking finally.
Some new and unfamiliar spells that Keltham will see about identifying in substantially increased total quantity. No sanctuary, no vision of hell, no protection, no enchantment foil, no spell immunity, no summon monster 3. Cool. He sort of wants to eat breakfast around people, and at the same time doesn't know anybody or trust anybody, and the only person now that he could even arguably eat breakfast with is, like Ionisala, maybe possibly Asmodia if she could be rescued. Frankly, what he wants is to eat breakfast with Iomede. Keltham leaves his bedroom to find out what's up around here. He doesn't forget to bring with the pin of glibness.
The palace of the Pharaoh of Osirian is not less luxurious than the palace at Igorian of Cheliax's infernal majesty. It is stylistically pretty distinct. Osirian has not made a lot of changes to impress Keltham. They're not making errors about the organization of their society on purpose, and if they are making errors, they want him to know about them to help them correct them. But they have ensured that all of the concubines are dressed the same as the male palace staff. They're not planning to hide that that wasn't how it worked yesterday, just maybe it'll help get off on the right foot. The palace is mostly full of open, half-overlapping courtyards and balconies. The sky up above is the eerie, magically lit dome interior, not the sky. There is a small packet of notes for Keltham. Each of them includes some money for his trouble reading them.
Micropayments. Keltham is happy for all of 2 rounds before he remembers not to be. Decor seems very standard, very prosaic. Sky effect is interesting. What do the notes say?
Keltham. We met yesterday. I am Prince Merenre, a 6th Circle priest of Abadar and the Pharaoh's primary advisor on economics research, and lately, the Keltham situation. I'd like to extend an invitation to join me and my wife Ismat, who developed a system for training non-wizards to craft magic items, for breakfast. Today is not particularly better for us than any other day this week.
The next letter inquires as to the intellectual property status of the things Osirian stole from Cheliax through espionage on the project. All spending and profits related to that are enclosed for his review, and they haven't spread it onwards. The final letter has a list of all of the palace servants, concubines, royals, church operatives, etc., who did not decline to participate, and the prices they listed under fairness this morning for Keltham to grab them in particular for an hour of questions if he happens to want to talk to a not very selected person. There are hundreds of people on it. Many of them listed negative prices because they think Keltham grabbing them in particular would be really cool.
Feels like the next story arc of Unreality is supposed to be the one where they imitate civilization, and like he's finally home at last, and he has to notice all the smaller notes wrong with that, which will be harder to detect compared to the louder notes in Cheliax, now that he, the reader, have been alerted that conspiracies are a thing. Who's got the largest negative price? Keltham is contemplating trying the most predictable action possible to see what the next layer of conspiracy prepared for that. There was probably something clever he was supposed to do, to have the character Corva Talandria with him at this point, who'd be very useful for figuring this out. Like, not get her almost sent to hell. That was probably the flag event he missed.
Largest negative price. 7th Circle Cleric of Abadar Temos Savendivison put 1,250 GP.
Okay, sure. Let's try that one. Keltham was planning to ask a lot of questions about theology and afterlives anyways. If there is some kind of bizarre metal-iterary mirror universe business going on, he'd like to know about that part immediately, actually. How does this guy feel about breakfast, and then maybe helping Keltham spend a bunch of time in a library trying to figure out what's up with the universe? It can go on longer than 1 hour to make up for any time Keltham spends eating or reading, instead of just asking questions directly.
He is willing to do that, though he actually just arrived and saw this last night, so he isn't an expert on the palace library.
Well, does he have a negative price for a quarter hour, then? Keltham does need somebody who knows the palace library well, he's pretty sure, but Keltham doesn't want to miss whatever it is he's supposed to find out here. So maybe just breakfast. Keltham realizes he's making an expression he copied off Carissa and wipes it off his face.
Sure, 500 for a quarter hour. They can have breakfast brought up to a table on one of the balconies overlooking one of the courtyards. Demos Sevandivison looks exactly like the fake priest of fake Abadar Keltham met yesterday.
So, you look exactly like somebody with a very similar but not identical name that I saw in a scry of Absalom yesterday. I'm actually going to just say this out loud, because if it crashes local reality, I think I'd actually be happy with that outcome.
I generally work from Absalom. I came to Suthis yesterday afternoon following a suspicious interaction with a Chelish agent. Our best guess is that they intended to use a real conversation between the agent and myself to get information to feed you, and then they had to alter their plan on the fly when I refused them, but you probably know much more about that than we do. It's indeed why I was so desperately curious to meet you.
How totally logical. Keltham actually does remember, then, something about Carissa saying yesterday that she used the Queen's overpriced headband to make up an entire theology. Which, sure, very legitimate rationalization for this in retrospect. Maybe the point of this part is to raise his alarm level and then defuse it with a totally logical explanation. That's to signal to the reader that most things about the pseudo-civilization will seem to make sense at first and won't just have outright transparent flaws on day one. Well, they got your appearance off the brief encounter, and then I had a long conversation with, I think actually my girlfriend, and her version of Abadarian theology, which was basically that Abadar was about running business concerns. I assigned her a research-level math problem to do while we were talking, and at one point also tickled her, because I was suspicious that what you were saying was something she could fake. But she was apparently wearing the crown of infernal something at the time, and was able to juggle all of that simultaneously. You should send her a bill for using your name and likeness. I'm genuinely curious about whether she'd pay it.
I'll try if no one can think of a reason that's a terrible idea. I'm not sure just from the description running business concerns whether it's something where there's genuine Abadaran theology or not. From my own background, I'm much more concerned with the applications to governance, but there are merchants who've made progress on theology related to running a business that captures wealth in an Abadaran fashion and not through coercion or deception or things that end up amounting to it.
I was trying to verify that I was talking to a genuine priest of Abadar, who I did not know at the time was, supposedly, my god, and that you were hearing my actual questions, and responding to those in ways that only a priest of Abadar should have been able to do. Except that their version of Abadar was supposedly just about economics, supply-demand stuff. So, for example, after I asked you about women not being able to own property in Osirian, and you said that women had relatively more rights after Abadar took over, and Osirion was slowly moving in a generally Chelish direction. There, I asked you to say something economics about that. You gave an extended analysis of how different combat rules in Avestan had resulted in fewer men, an oversupply of women, and that had invalidated mating strategies where women held out for marriage.
Amos isn't very readable, but in a different way than Chelish people. It's like he's very deliberate about the steps between hearing something and deciding how he feels about it, so his response is faster than the eventual arrival of his face at a trouble expression. There might be something to that. Nonetheless, I find myself objecting that it's not the answer any true priest of Abadar would have given you. It is too purely descriptive, and we would struggle to refrain from referring you to a dozen different papers about theoretical models of filial piety in the course of trying to give you a proper answer.
What's the actual situation there, relatively briefly? I've got a number of high-level questions and should go through them breadth first before going deep on any of them.
About Osirian and sexism? Osirian is unpleasantly sexist, the church less so than nearly every other social institution in it, but still enough to appall you, probably if you're accustomed to places that treat men and women no differently. I wouldn't raise a family here, wouldn't really even live here. I don't have a fundamental values disagreement with my colleagues in the Osirian church, I don't think. We just have very different instincts on some questions that are hard to answer.
Have to say, if the representation I got of Osirian was basically true, that women can't own property, among my first instinctive reactions there would be to tell them I'll only be teaching Osirian women, so as not to distract the men from their important work of owning property and being allowed to participate in the economy.
And I might be misunderstanding what you'd hope to accomplish by that, but I don't think it'd work. Among other obstacles, women in Osirion overwhelmingly cannot read or write, and that is in fact the main sense in which it's true they can't own property. The sort of educated woman with independent means of support or a supportive husband who'd be able to attend your classes also is able to meaningfully participate in the economy in every other way.
Well, breadth first, I do remind myself. Deep dive on that can wait. Trying to figure out what I'd preferentially ask somebody from Absalom, besides a non-local view on whatever the ass people here are doing. Okay, the Starstone. Were people possibly lying to me about that? Because the version I got, Eridan came across a giant glowy rock that could have been used to produce, 100 of Eomede, and put up a huge warded magical containment fortress around it, so that only worthy people could get through, one of whom is the god of crime, and one of whom is a guy who did it on a drunken bet. Is there a sane version of this story?
People weren't lying. People who speculate a lot about this kind of thing speculate that existing gods have some kind of veto power over new gods ascending, and the protections Eridan placed either prevent the existing gods from interfering with the ascension of new ones or satisfy some negotiated condition that allows Eridan to aid the new gods, which would of course now not matter as Eridan is dead. Or that the deaths of most who try in fact power the ascensions of those who succeed, or that Norgorber and Caden were concessions in exchange for Eomedai, or that the Starstone in fact can ascend a fixed number of people, or a fixed number per period of time, such that rationing it makes sense.
Now that is interesting. Obvious thoughts that Keltham isn't going to go into, because breadth-first examination, if the Starstone is being rationed. Why Caden Kalian and Norgorber? Just the first ones through when the winning ticket came up. Has anybody kept a record of number of Starstone entrants and deaths between ascensions? Eridan was ascended by Starstone, but seems to have been much more powerful than Eomedai. Did he get more of what the Starstone can offer, if the fortress rations it? What if Eridan was trying to create as many human gods as possible, such that Caden and Norgorber, being potential successes, mattered more than their future alignments or domains? Somebody supposedly an Oracle of Nethys, who may have actually been that, if the person who showed up to take her was the real Nefreti Klepati, which she proved by predicting a fairly random future fact, told me that Earthfall shattered prophecy for the second time, with the first time being Rovagug, and that after Earthfall the gods took the last fragments of twice-shattered prophecy and made a prophecy about a lawful neutral god who'd use the Starstone to make Golarion their domain and then contain Rovagug forever, which Eridan saw coming, changed himself to match the conditions of, and then Eridan's death shattered all prophecy in Golarion forever. Is that plausible?
We don't have much in the way of records from the time of Rovagug, but the fact there was a war with lots of gods on both sides is suggestive that something was interfering with prophecy. Usually, you see them pay each other to sit it out. I've never heard the claim that Eridan specifically tried to be the god the prophesied Age of Glory was about as opposed to, well, being the god the prophecy was about all along. It is true that Eridan's death shattered prophecy and that everyone thinks that's permanent, and Abadar, and for that matter Asmodeus, are acting like it's long-term, making long-term investments in new methods of intervention on Golarion.
People in the conspiracy, the face Cheliax presented to me, seem to think, well, maybe it was just that Carissa seemed to think that unleashing Rovagug was game over, that it would inevitably destroy everything. Is that conventional, mainstream, academically respectable theology? I would think that if the last set of gods managed to seal Rovagug, and all the gods who fought on its side are now dead, and there have been some new gods since then, you'd expect that releasing Rovagug would just end with it being sealed again? What do people think they know, and how do they think they know it?
I don't know much about Rovagug. To my knowledge, there were not human civilizations on the face of Golarion when Rovagug first reached the world, and that if there had been, the war that sealed him would probably have killed them all, and possibly just killed every living thing on the planet's surface. There are new gods, but that doesn't mean that the aggregate strength of all the gods opposed to the destruction of the world exceeds what it did at the time. The new gods are mostly very weak compared to the ancient ones, and I don't know if the ancient ones have more or less power than they did then. It might be that the expended resources they have never since regained, not even now. No one has good information on this. It is expensive for the gods to communicate their secrets, and it's hard to imagine under what circumstances any church would consider this information decision relevant. There was a prophecy that some threat greater than Rovagug would appear eventually, and that Asmodeus would unleash Rovagug, hoping that Rovagug would consume that enemy and then be possible to contain, or that they'd weaken each other, and that instead Rovagug would consume everything, and that's how the universe would end. But prophecy's broken, and I don't know if that one was ever very definite.
You'd imagine not, since otherwise Asmodeus would be taking an action known to Asmodeus to lead to failure? Huh. There's a flash of anger in Keltham's thoughts at the mention of that god. Keltham may actually be angry here. Anything else in the set that includes Rovagug, the Starstone, and Pharasma? It sounds like those are 3 known things from outside the local universe. Is there a 4th?
There are many other outer gods of a class with Pharasma, supposedly, but their concerns are so alien to us that they mostly cannot even be comprehended, and Pharasma prevents them from doing whatever they do with this star system and these souls and these afterlives if unimpeded. The Starstone's not from outside the local universe. It was created when several gods sacrificed themselves to slow the moon that collided with the world when Earthfall happened.
I thought I read a version that something else was coming, and the gods collided a moon with it to try to stop it, but that didn't work. It just smashed through the moon.
The account I'd heard was that an underwater civilization on Galarian tried to pull an asteroid down onto Galarian to destroy a surface civilization they were at war with, thinking they'd survive it. They miscalculated, and it would have destroyed life on the planet. The gods moved the moon to deflect it and then sacrificed themselves to slow the fragments in their collision with the world. But something from outside the local universe played no particular part in it, except in the sense that all asteroids are from very far away. It was initiated by a Galarian civilization deliberately. There are many other examples of things from very far away, impacting Galarian, of course. Famously, something landed in Numeria long ago, and the gods put up a bubble around it. No one who enters is ever possible to communicate with or get information about again, including in an afterlife. And I've heard it claimed Baba Yaga is from another universe.
If you pull down an asteroid that's massive enough and fast enough to shatter a moon on impact, a reasonable civilization wouldn't expect to survive that impact in the first place. That's not the kind of calculation that's easy to screw up if you can redirect asteroids at all. And also, you wouldn't expect the asteroid to have a core piece left over that turned people into gods when they touched it. And the whole thing sounds like maybe agents weren't choosing optimally, which makes it sound prophecy-shattering, which you wouldn't expect random asteroids to be. You can imagine entities from outside sending in something like an uplifter, or maybe a poisoned gift, a star stone that uplifts cooperative civilizations that will eventually trade with you, who will be grateful for the help. But if the local civilization starts fighting over the star stone instead of just using it on everyone, it's also very easy to weaponize. We've got a whole subsection of literature about that, how aliens might send us gifts cleverly meant to destroy us. Sorry, going depth first again. What's known about the larger universe that includes outer gods, and not just? It sounds like maybe this whole local region of reality is inside a bubble that Pharasma is maintaining.
I have never heard of any indication that Earthfall involved problems with prophecy, except that the Algothals died and didn't expect to, and I think you might be operating from a wrong conception of what kinds of mistakes civilizations make when they're smart enough to avoid them. There are also other examples of the death of a god leaving magical residue that enables other entities to ascend. There's a famous case in Tian Xia, so my understanding was always that the death of the gods in Earthfall left the magical residue that made the Starstone, which is what you'd expect to happen insofar as you have expectations about that anyway. I don't know anything about the outer gods beyond that there are entities like Pharasma which are not comprehensible or wise to try to comprehend, and Pharasma maintains this universe and largely discourages their intervening here.
No, sorry. Even for Galarian, in order to strike at your enemies, redirect an asteroid towards your planet using careful orbital calculations, which on arrival will be going fast enough to blow right through your moon and shatter it, is a bit much. A much smaller moon than Dathilan's, presumably, but still. You need a certain basic level of competence at doing calculations like that in order to redirect asteroids and get them on target at all. Are there any known instances of helpful interventions from beyond? Any signs that we have friends out there? Or is it all things like something landing that has to get enclosed in an anti-info hazard barrier, Dubral getting inverted to Zon Kuthon, possibly the Starstone.
I don't have friends out there. That is the closest thing to a consensus that exists about the outer gods.
Oh, right. There's another way to guess that prophecy was broken during Earthfall. Keltham was rationalizing too fast on account of Ione having told him where his answer would end up. There are multiple pieces of evidence here. He'll probably find more later. He doesn't need to leap on individual points as decisive arguments. Abadar paid Zon Kuthon to go into the plane of shadow for as long as the sun was in the sky. The book I read presented it as a surprise gotcha when Earthfall blotted out the sun. If the gods knew about Earthfall, Abadar wouldn't have chosen that term or been caught. Be surprised? Actually, that sounds like Zon Kuthon maybe knew about Earthfall coming. Counter-argument. Maybe the agreement wasn't meant to last any longer than it did, and both sides knew that. But, yeah, I buy that we don't have friends out there. Just to be explicit about it, though, any known inhabited other stars, alien species?
Yes, it's believed there are lots. Abadarans like publishing papers about how to have trade relationships with them in principle, but it's probably too dangerous in practice. Absent Abadar's specific assurance it's safe in a given case.
Believe there are lots? How do you end up believing but not knowing?
Well, every planet in our star system is inhabited by aliens of one stripe or another, and sometimes distant stars wink out or behave oddly as if being altered by some deliberate intent, and some petitioners in Axis are not from Galarian. Though we don't have enough communications with the other planets around our star to rule out that all of the mortals with souls live on different planets in this star system, and the other star systems have only gods and mindless beasts and whatever sent the thing that landed in Numeria. I would be very surprised by that, though.
Are there other entire planes, like this one and having mortals in them, and their own set of star systems, that are not this plane, but part of Pharasma's bubble and connected to her afterlife system?
There could easily be, but I haven't encountered specific evidence of that.
You'd expect the afterlives to know about it if there were aliens from lots of different planes showing up. They'd know whether they remembered constellations consistent with being in the same galaxy as everyone else.
It's not at all obvious to me that people would remember constellations in such a fashion as to usefully figure that out, especially since in many worlds the stars might not be visible or everyone might live underground. But even if Axis did know whether all of the aliens come from the material plane and demi-planes originating from the material, the gods are prohibited from sharing all the secrets of the universe with us. We cannot simply pay Axis for a book of all they know of the universe, even if we could afford it.
They literally can't tell you how large your universe is. That seems like a bit much, frankly. So, yeah. What's up with the prohibitions on afterlives telling the mortals? Just about literally anything, it sounds like. Whose idea was it? Is there a reason?
The explanation I always found made the most sense to me is that, for any god, at least when prophecy yet endured, there were 100 words that they could speak that would turn all mortals to their service. And the gods who did not approve of mortals being so manipulated bargained for communications to be too limited for that, which means limited indeed.
And there's no carve-out for telling mortals how to mine spell silver, or make huge quantities of acid, or the other things they'd need to know to lead better lives than this. Question mark?
Abadar would almost certainly sell us information about industrial processes if it were permitted for him to do so.
Is there a known reason why that prohibition is meant to be protective of mortals?
It might be a concession as part of a deal that was overall beneficial to mortals, but I think if it were in itself beneficial to mortals, then Abadar would be handling your arrival here very differently.
Because Abadar cares about mortals' welfare? On reflection, when Keltham was casting out his thoughts, seeking the god of Keltham, he did not in fact specify that his god should care about any such thing, only the forms of coordination. Keltham, at that time, had not thought much of being told to care about other people, rather than just trading with them honestly.
Abadar cares about trading fairly with mortals. What we do with our share of the gains from trade is up to us. He's the god of our having more resources and more capacities, not of us employing them in any specific way. But if he had some way that was not very costly to him to make us much better off, he would do it, anticipating that we are the kind of people who, when we've grown up, when we're richer and stronger, will repay him the favor, as the fair trading gods do among themselves.
But he's not, sad about people going to hell.
I would assume that he objects to most instances in the real world of people going to hell, but if people, fully comprehending what hell is, decide to go there for some benefit to them and get the promised benefit to them, I wouldn't imagine he objects to that, no. Nor do I.
Why would he object to most instances in the real world of people going to hell? Because everyone ought to go to Axis, and not hell or Elysium.
No, because they're not making an informed choice, and if they're promised a benefit, they might not receive it. Elysium is fine. Why would Abadar object to people going to Elysium?
From Abadar's perspective, what, if anything, in this regard, differentiates going to hell from, let's say, getting sick and dying of a painful disease?
Your question seems obvious enough to me. I wonder if I'm misunderstanding it. Abadar prefers for all entities which have values and priorities that they deal fairly and be dealt fairly with, that they prosper through creating wealth and have more resources with which to attain what they value. If an entity prefers not to get sick and die painfully, which nearly any entity would, then presumably they'll expend some of their own resources on preventing that, and if they didn't prevent that, they didn't have enough resources, and that's worse than the world where there was more abundance. If an entity, for some puzzling to you or I reason, preferred to get sick and die painfully, or had lots of resources but didn't disprefer getting sick or dying painfully enough to spend the resources on that instead of on other things they valued more, then that's fine. It is no concern of ours if other peoples want other things, so long as they're the kind of people who deal fairly. In a sense, that's why dealing fairly is so important, because it permits us to grow wealthier alongside entities very alien to us with concerns very different from ours. If an entity dies and goes to hell because someone falsely told them that hell was a really nice afterlife where they'd have a lovely time, that is anathema to Abadar. If they die and go to hell because someone truthfully told them that you go to hell if you murder lots of people, but they really wanted to murder lots of people because they valued the products of those murders more than they disvalued going to hell, fine. If they die and go to hell because they want to, fine.
Well, Iomide said that Abadar wanted me to explain what I was thinking back then when I contacted Abadar, without having any idea who I was reaching out to. Roughly that, but with math. And I owe Abadar, so I'll get that done. It's not something I can do in a day, but I'll get it done. Breakfast is gone. Keltham doesn't really remember eating it, but there was food on his plate, and now there's not, so he must have eaten. If we call it here, did you get your money's worth? That still matters a lot, to Keltham. It's just that other things have started to matter too.
Yes, I did. He looks troubled. There are many lawful good followers of Abadar, Keltham. A common reason among humans to follow the god of trade and prosperity and fairness is because you want the world to be better, and you assess that trading with Abadar will give you resources you can use to achieve your own ends. Abadar sees that and approves of it in us. Wealth means fewer dead children, fewer suffering people going to hell, which looks like much less of a good trade when safety and wealth and power can be attained in other ways.
Other people joining this multi-agent dilemma just have to consider which side they can most benefit given their comparative advantage and who they should make a little stronger. I'm trying to figure out what the final game board should look like when it's over. I suspect I already know the answer to this, but I'll ask anyways. In all of the negotiations between gods that decided all this setup, was any representative of humanity, of the mortals, ever invited to the table, without their having become a god themselves?
I doubt it very much. We, wouldn't actually understand what was going on, and we'd be damaged by attempting it. It's the awkwardness inherent to Abadar's efforts to trade with us. He tries very hard, but actually cannot meet the standards of mutual comprehension and legibility that gods have, among another. There are similarities to trying to do right by your 2-year-old, or your horse.
Sure. There's one god of cooperating with agents who cooperate with him, even if those agents can't understand him well enough to make their cooperation conditional on his cooperation. And then, to the other gods who were never human, we're just a sort of object that they can arrange in ways that suit their utility function. We're like that to all of the ancient gods, really. It's just that Abadar's utility function is about unconditionally treating agents the way you'd treat them if they actually could negotiate with you.
Most everything out there in the universe is going to be very, very alien to us and have no concern for us as we have none for them. Trade is a way to have wealth and abundance and mutual benefit, even though that's true. Also, I think the ancient good gods do care about humans more than that summary captures, but I'm not really an expert on the ancient good gods.
I wish, alongside a lot of other wishes, that I could from Dathilan bring in a few 100,000 novels from the trade with aliens genre. I think you'd enjoy them. Though you'd probably disagree some with Dathilan about where the average author draws the line about aliens you should not trade with. It was a lawful good civilization, not a lawful neutral one. Different authors drew that line in different places, as produced millions and millions and billions of discussion board comments about whether a line was being drawn in the right place. Keltham can't recall hearing of any books about whether to trade with Hell. Well, to be fair, if that did exist in Dathilan, it would be far in the depths of the ill-advised consumer goods shop, and Keltham wouldn't have heard about it. I need to find somebody who indexes the palace library and then do a lot of sporadic reading on topics including ancient good gods. Possibly see you around. I don't know how long you're staying for. You're usually in Absalom?
Yes, though it's not a long trip, you wouldn't have to pay me much to make it, if you want me specifically again. My actual specialty is in strategies for land reform, likely not relevant to the most immediate of your plans.
Civilization's end state was to charge an annual fee for the value of the land before it was improved, or for the scarcity value of underlying resources being extracted if those resources were scarce, which conceptually was the rent of everybody in civilization and in practice was used to run governance. I was pretty upset as a kid about how it wasn't just being paid to me directly. If you want to know how the pricing schemes worked, I can describe them with another 5 minutes I'm happy to take. If you already know where you're going, and the big problem is getting Galarian there, I can't help as much.
I'd say getting Golarion there is the harder half of the problem, but I will definitely take 5 minutes of your time to explain the details of how that's implemented, if it's on offer.
Doesn't require much thought from him if he's talking to somebody who already knows some of the math. Everybody in Dathilan knows how this works, and why.
Then Temos Sevandevasan will depart this meeting practically glowing with delight, despite all the concerning stuff in the middle there.
Keltham does remember at the last minute to quickly inquire, before he goes, about Asmodea's warning that he needed to ask about early, that it was illegal here to say some things about the pharaoh. That seems like something it might be wise to ask somebody from Absalom.
Sirion, like most places, fines people for publishing false material on religious questions, which in Osirian means material out of line with the teachings of the Church of Abadar and churches allied with it, and Osirian bans evangelism for chaotic and evil gods. If you want to get a sense of what people get up to in places that don't have any such laws, I'd check out Hulamog, which doesn't, or have someone send you books from there. There are many genuine benefits to less restrictive laws, but also Hulamog has an active cult of Asmodeus that teaches that he is unfairly maligned, is actually chaotic good, hell is awesome, and devils just like trolling people to make their lives more interesting. Balancing the different public interests here strikes me as genuinely hard. Absalom is freer than Osirian. I like that better, and if you like that better too, we'd certainly be delighted to host you.
Am I liable to get in trouble or burn a lot of political capital by asking people to explain the rules? Even if I ask in some incredibly naive and alien fashion that, I don't know, takes for granted that men and women sometimes pay each other for sex?
I don't know, Naya. You're an alien. They know it, and I'd be very surprised if they took offense about it. They will meticulously make sure you're never alone in a room with a woman and be offended if you circumvent them about that, but they'll be happy to explain why if you ask.
I'll be asking, yes. Good skill in Absalom. And if a weird girl with cookies appears to you there and tells you to do something nonsensical, I would strongly advise doing it.
I don't keep that in mind, though. Whatever Caden Kalian's doing, I can't say I am on his side. When Cheliax came to me looking for help deceiving you, I told the man I'd pay him 80,000 gold and extend the church's protection if he wanted to defect. Playing along more than that does, to speak bluntly, feel complicit to me.
Consider me to have been told that, and to have nonetheless repeated my advice about the cookie thing.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.